A drop of Bordeaux arcs through crystalline time. It catches the chandelier light, a slow red comet. For a fraction of a second everything freezes. The glass, the brass filigree, a woman's hand in mid-gesture. Then the liquid explodes across a black tuxedo and a white shirt, and the room exhales all at once. He stands still. The wine beads on his collar leaves a warm stain on his chest. Laughter and outrage collide. Fingers snap out phones like moths to a porch light. Someone screams, a single bright syllable that might be anger or glee. Vivian Blackwood's voice cuts across the clatter, sharp as a crack in porcelain. Her words are meant to reduce, to draw a line in the marble under all the foot traffic and conversation. She intends spectacle. She expects collapse. Jerome Washington smiles. It is a small thing, not a grin, not a gloat. A measured curve at the corner of his mouth that does not leave his eyes. For a handful of people near him, the smile reads like disbelief. For most, it reads like surrender. Cameras close in, lenses hunting for outrage. Commentators will later call it stoicism. In the moment, it is a mystery. She's thrown wine on him. She's called him names, attacked him in public to remind this room who belongs where. And he smiles. Phones ripple. The recording begins to spread before a waiter can reach for a napkin. Someone urges Vivian to stop, to be civilized. She is beyond civility. She steps back as if to admire the stain as proof of her audacity, as if the wine were a petition signed in blood. She tilts her chin to the crowd and repeats the slur, the phrase that drops the room 3 degrees colder, a phrase framed by entitlement and a deliberate erasure. No microphone will carry the exact syllables into the long tail of the internet in full. For the record, she hurls a string of racial invective that the cameras will soften with bleeps and captions later. Racial slur will appear on headlines in brackets and quotation marks. The sting remains. The chandelier trembles with the collective breath. Jerome's hand remains at his side. He does not wipe the wine off. He does not return fire. He does not raise his voice. He simply keeps looking, as if cataloging details. The tilt of Vivian's chin, the glint of her bracelet, the smear of Bordeaux on the silk, the way the lights catch on her pearls. He notices the phones first. Hundreds of lenses. The angle of one camera that will make the stain look like an intentional tableau. The soft buzz of a notification already starting in pockets. Someone near him, Sarah Lane, his communications director, grabs for a napkin and then freezes. Sarah knows the 1,000 ways a narrative can be steered. She sees the room's energy pulse towards spectacle. William Hayes, a board representative from a partner firm, lunges forward, a practiced face of concern that reads panic. Across the hall, Richard Blackwood's jaw tightens. He tastes the social cost of an upended evening the way other men taste salt. "You can't do this here," Vivian says, breathless with performative outrage. "Not at our gala." Her voice calls for rescue from the exact people she believes will supply it. Friends, influence, the class that legitimizes her. She expects sympathy, a small chorus to drown the cameras. Instead, she finds silence, and then the slow, merciless click of phones. The room is recording. The room is waiting. The room wants a script. Jerome's smile widens, not in triumph but in recognition. He closes his fingers around the fabric of his shirt, and with a motion so small it is almost private, he reaches into his inside pocket and slides out something flat and leather-bound. The portfolio is old money polished into new discipline, dark brown leather, a subtle embossed name, a line of wear at the seam. The camera catches the glint of gold letters. Washington Capital Group. He opens it. He does not raise his voice yet. He does not shout accusations. He does the thing he does best. He shows what his presence means. 7:45 p.m. Gala, Grand Hall, Blackwood Estate. If anyone had expected Jerome's humiliation to play into a narrative they owned, they are about to learn otherwise. The room watches as he methodically extracts a document. The lighting in the hall throws hard shadows over the script pages, like stage lighting on a confession. He flips the portfolio so that the crowd can see an embossed seal, a signature in familiar ink. He holds up the paper. A crisp line of text, typed and stamped, stares back. Washington Capital Group, Agreement for Urban Development Partnership. At the top, the time. 9:47 a.m., the day's date. To the trained eye, it is not an idle piece of stationery. It is a transfer machine, capital, permission, green lights. To the untrained eye, it is simply a paper that dissolves the comfortable assumptions of the room. You signed this morning, Vivian says, incredulous. What are you doing here? Signed, Jerome repeats. His voice is a low instrument, the kind that moves a room without breaking it. At 9:47 a.m. I signed, with your family's counsel, with terms that would have more than doubled your projections. The pen was in my hand twice today. A hand in the back doesn't believe it. You're bluffing, someone mutters. Others cling to that hope like a life raft. Richard moves closer. He puts on the expression of a man who has never needed to plead in public. Private men have private muscles for denial. He flexes them now. We have a handshake, he says. We have commitments we can't. Jerome interrupts, and the interruption is a pivot. You made a spectacle to remind people of where they think I belong, he says. He holds the portfolio so that everyone can see the ink. I will not accept being a prop in a pageant of superiority. I am withdrawing Washington Capital Group's participation. The agreement is rescinded. The gallery fractures. Someone laughs. An ugly bark that no one will include in the edited headline. Someone cries. The cameras zoom. Hungry. Vivian's face contorts from triumph to fury to a bright, surprised fear. She has expected to humiliate a man she sees as smaller. She did not expect him to hold the hand that controlled $1 billion faucet. She did not expect him to know the exact pressure points of her world. In the pockets and the corners, phones blossom into social evidence. A waiter's video starts to collect views before the dessert course is finished. Within 15 minutes, there will be 10,000 uploads. Within 20, trending tags will summon pundits and activists in equal measure. But in the first moments, it's just the room, the live sound, and Jerome's steady voice. Sarah's face tightens and then relaxes in a way that signals competence. She has rehearsed this precise choreography with Jerome, the reveal, the withdrawal, the claim. For months they have mapped the legal scaffolding behind such a public step. The team has contingency clauses, non-disparagement addenda, and liquidated damages precisely designed for the mercantile weather that wealth brings. Jerome knows the cost. He also knows the law can be wielded slowly and loudly at once. William Hayes slides a hand into his jacket and starts making calls. He is already thinking about damage control and investors. He is thinking in the clean mathematics of exposure. Richard's eyes flick to him, pleading for a calculus that will restore a number. But the number responds poorly to violence in public. Numbers are sensitive. Markets are social. A photograph of humiliation can become the vector for capital to rethink exposure overnight. The first clip circulates on social. Within 20 minutes there is averted breath and 1,000 captions. Black CEO humiliated at elite gala, one reads. Powerful man smiles after being attacked. The frames vary. Some tilt to frame Vivian's aristocratic gasp. Some linger on the crimson stain. The internet is a machine that splices shame and pity and analysis into a single feed. The sound bites are short. He smiled. Why didn't he fight back? She's gone too far. In the barbershop 4 blocks from Jerome's childhood home, Mr. Johnson hears about it before the national shows do. He's mid-shave, the radio murmuring a flicker of the clip, and he stops with the razor in his hand. He has cut Jerome's hair since Jerome was a teenager with fresh, ambitious hands and a pocket full of ideas. Mr. Johnson remembers the boy who would hold court about startups between snips of clippers. He remembers the first time Jerome walked into the shop in a suit, the way his shoulders carried new weight. Now he listens and says aloud words that land like a benediction on the old chairs. He kept his head. 9:47 a.m. That morning still sits heavy. Jerome thinks of it now, not as a flash of triumph but as a ledger. He rises at dawn, has coffee black as truth, and drives downtown to the law office where his team waits. The development plan they've been negotiating is precise. A mixed-use corridor with affordable units, community retail, a satellite campus for vocational training, and a trust for small business microloans. It's ambitious. It's structured to move capital into neighborhoods the Blackwood's legacy has historically excluded. The math is complicated, but its moral arithmetic is simple. Money that moves people can change trajectories. Jerome signs. When he leaves the office, he walks past a row of construction cranes and a woman getting her children onto a bus. He passes a corner where a shuttered realty once sat and notices, habit, how rain beads on the new glass half-built. The morning signature contains clauses for oversight, for community boards, for binding allocations. It also contains termination language for reputational harm. Jerome is not naive about the kind of harm introduced by a socialite's tirade. He built pause into the contract because he expects the world to be as messy as it often is. He goes to the barber afterward. Mr. Johnson gives him a haircut, and the two exchange small talk and larger truths. The barber knows what the development will mean for the neighborhood, and Jerome knows the faces that will change if the project funds scholarship and mentorship and storefront loans. These are not abstractions. They are named people who will be able to afford rent, to open a business, to hire a cousin. Jerome's signature is a promise to people he has carried with him since boyhood. It is not vindictive. It is not showy. It is pragmatic and precise. The gala was supposed to be ceremonial. It was meant to be a handshake in front of old money and newer capital. It was meant to be a photograph of reconciliation. Vivian Blackwood, who had never thought the people on Jerome's side mattered beyond their function as labor and flavor, chose spectacle instead of handshake. That arrogance is always an ecosystem unto itself, a self-reinforcing belief that people will be docile, that consequences belong to others. Back in the hall, the smile on Jerome's face is a hinge. People begin to interpret where they stand based on how he looks at them. Some tilt toward shame, others toward analysis. The sound of a trading bell seems impossible here, but the metaphor is accurate. Balance can tip with the right small motion. He lays the document on a table as if it were a chess piece. You will find, he tells the room, that terms include oversight committees and allocations for neighborhoods that until now have been priced out. That agreement is public record, and we have already posted a preliminary summary. I will not have this work subsidized by spectacle. Vivian's voice becomes thin. You can't do this, she repeats, as if saying the words again will make the pilgrim's pen return. Jerome smiles, and those who will later tell the story will call it many things: stoicism, courage, a saint's patience. The truth is more strategic. He knows the mechanisms that connect social humiliation to corporate liability. He knows that when the cameras are rolling, a slur that is audible to 5 people can be amplified to 5 million. He knows that fund managers knit their portfolios together out of risk and reputation. He signed the agreement that morning intentionally, with clauses that permit immediate withdrawal for reputational injury inflicted by the partner's executive conduct. He has tools. He opens one. Phones flare to life in the corners of the room. The first tweet stacks against the second. Analysts start forming narratives on the fly. Within 10 minutes, social feeds thread through the footage. Commentators ask why Jerome didn't retaliate. Opinion divides. Some hail the dignity of restraint. Some, particularly enraged by Vivian's words, want to see more retribution. The narrative fractures the way a prism fractures light. Jerome's public move will allow institutional levers, investors, counsel, compliance committees, to act without needing to ride the emotional demand for immediate revenge. William Hayes moves now. He crosses the ballroom floor, phone to ear, voice clipped with the language of investors. We need an immediate statement. Liaise with legal. Get the counsel on standby. He is a man who has spent his life calibrating risk. A public assault is a contamination vector. For corporate partners, contamination is measurable, and markets have their own sensibilities about cleanliness. Vivian retreats to the outer circle, eyes wide and raw. Her husband, Richard, strides after her with a face built from the tools of denial. For a man used to markets moving the way he moves them, commanding, coaxing, polishing, this is a new variable. His conversation with William, clipped and desperate, sounds like a boardroom argument that will be televised tonight. We have commitments that are now at risk, Richard hisses. This is our family's name. From the pockets and the corners, the room begins to fragment into scenes that will stitch together the next 24 hours. Whispers that become threads. Threads that become headlines. Headlines that become calls to compliance teams. Compliance teams that phone law firms that scan contracts for clauses that will manifest in the daylight hours with the methodology of actual consequences. Jerome knows how long that wire takes to strum. The frenzy is not only corporate, it is also private. In a small apartment uptown, a young woman who has been following Jerome's nonprofit work since college watches the clip on a shaky live stream and texts her supervisor, "This is going to change things." A local pastor who once spoke of Jerome's integrity into a congregation that now includes potential interns grips his phone and thinks of scholarships. In a newsroom, a producer tosses a hard headline into the wire service. Black CEO withdraws from development after public humiliation. The headline is a blade. It slices, and the pieces fall into algorithms hungry for clicks. Sarah Lane pulls Jerome aside for 2 minutes that are all business. They step away from the center like players excusing themselves mid-act. "We'll release a statement," she says. Her voice is even. "We'll show the agreement. We'll file notices. We'll align counsel. We'll make the clauses public. We'll emphasize the community protections." Jerome nods. Each phrase she names is a different tool. Reputational control, legal notification, community-first framing. They move with the economy of preparation that belongs to people who have weathered storms and learned to fold their hands just so. Outside, in a cab parked beneath an oak, 2 teenagers watch the clip on a cracked screen and talk about what it would mean to open a tech lab in their neighborhood. For them, the moment has a different resonance. It is not about spectacle. It is about permission. If Jerome's withdrawal forces the Blackwoods to lose funding, maybe other dollars will reorient. Maybe money that had trickled by will be redirected. Perhaps a scholarship fund will exist. Such outcomes are not inevitable. They are contingent on counsel, on settlements, on community processes that will take months to design and years to implement. But for a young woman on a couch, they are not unimaginable. Her cousin could have a shot. Meanwhile, newsrooms assemble packages like emergency kits. Producers assign boxes: legal, financial, social. A Chiron is prepared. An aggregator plots the flow of information. Clip at T+0. Studio segment at T+30. Op-ed at T+180. The machine starts to build a narrative scaffold that will support public judgment. Jerome and his team know how that scaffold looks. They also know what it will break if not managed. Investor confidence, supply agreements, philanthropic partnerships. At the center of the storm, Jerome stays still. He lets the world calibrate to his motion. He knows that dignity is not the absence of fire. It is choosing the means by which it is extinguished. For him, the goal is not satisfaction. It is structural accountability, making sure that the contempt of one person cannot function as the anchor of a family dynasty's public face. That is why he smiled. The smile is not an emotional misfire. It is a pause employed to gather information, to confirm a strategy already in motion, to signal control to people who must decide quickly what to do next. Vivian's camera angles multiply into feeds. Her friends begin to distance. Some murmur that she overstepped. Others claim she was provoked, that nuance will save her. There is no saving the moment from its photographic truth. The wine stain is already iconic. 1,000 micro-voices will punditize it and reframe the narrative to their taste. In the meantime, the first ripples of financial consequence begin like a distant storm. An analyst on an afternoon feed mentions reputational risk and the name Blackwood Industries in the same breath as liquidity. An investor, mid-portfolio allocation, calls his broker. The broker makes a note. The note gets slotted. Tickers do what tickers do. They respond to cues. Stocks are a social instrument. They move on perception of future earnings and on the way brands weather controversy. An executive who has always been able to count on influence now watches the network contract around his name. There are legal mechanics in play nobody in the ballroom knows in full detail. Jerome's legal team fires off a notice of rescission. It is a terse document. The law likes verbs that do not apologize. The notice triggers clauses tied to reputational injury. It is a formal key turned in a lock that the Blackwood Council did not expect to find so quickly. The letter is calm. It carries the force of process rather than vengeance. It is the sort of action that creates paperwork and thus makes the spectacle into a ledger of liabilities. Tension mounts in the law firms that represent old money. Partners assemble in glassed rooms. They craft statements that will later be called damage control. The word liability appears like a shadow on their screens. They calculate the costs of press versus the cost of actually addressing the harm. They spend time imagining outcomes. Jerome's legal move has given the universe of consequence a place to land, a contract clause. Contracts are stubborn. They demand remedy. Once the remedy process begins, it does not stop for salutes or apologies. It asks for evidence and money and witness testimony. It asks for change. The first commentary piece appears at 9:12 p.m. The headline frames Jerome's action as a turning point. The piece argues that dignity, when combined with leverage, demands work rather than revenge. It speculates cautiously about what may happen next. For every pundit who praises his restraint, another insists the withdrawal is performative. The internet, faithful to its nature, splits. The moment becomes a mirror in which each viewer sees themselves. Some as victims, others as arbiters of accountability. William Hayes is already back on his feet. He circulates between Richard and counsel and reporters. He orders a press release that will be rehearsed and precise. He is efficient because efficiency is what he has been taught to practice. Yet he cannot stop the social pressure that is beginning to bend the architecture of capital. Calls pile into the Blackwood corporate office from partners seeking clarity. Some ask plainly, do we still have a deal? Many hedge funds register the phrase reputational risk and shift weight. A message hits 8 trading desks as a heads up. Overnight becomes a crucible. The clip runs across morning shows in a loop. Pundits define the arc. Activists prepare statements. A few high-profile allies of Jerome issue short endorsements about his track record. The feeds are messy and human and quick to mythologize. In comments threads someone writes, he smiled because he knew exactly what to do. That distilled sentiment will later circulate as lesson and legend. In the hotel suite above the city, Richard paces and calls an old friend on a direct line. He asks about options. The friend replies with the mechanical kindness of someone who has advised men like Richard through many storms. You need to limit exposure. You need to distance. You need counsel that can move faster than press cycles. That is an admission of vulnerability. For all of the Blackwood's wealth, they now find themselves with a problem liquidity can't immediately fix. A moral problem made public. Meanwhile, Jerome slides the portfolio back into his coat. He feels the weight of the leather as if it were a tool he sharpened that morning. He does not look satisfied. He looks ready. In the corner of the hall, he sees Mr. Johnson's face in a video someone has uploaded from a watch party at the shop. The barber's nod is old and small and human. It is precisely the kind of marker Jerome cares about, the faces of people who will be impacted by the money redirected or withheld. As the night deepens, the story takes on architecture. It finds proponents, detractors, and a procedural substrate where institutions now have to decide what they value. Money learns to read behavior. Systems decide whether to reward or punish. Jerome has introduced a variable into a system that has long assumed immunity for certain people. He did it with a paper and a smile. He did it without violence. He did it with contracts and procedure, tools that speak in the language of institutions rather than the theater of crowds. By midnight, the clip has run through every major feed and seeded commentary. By 1:14 a.m., investment teams have called their chief counsel to flag emerging risk exposure. By 3:17 a.m., social feeds slow but do not sleep. The story moves into analysis and the slow-building legal choreography. Overnight, the markets will rattle like a chest being prodded by a doctor. There will be an opening bell to test the air. Inside the ballroom, after the last guest has left under the weight of a story not their own, Vivian sits in a corner by a window and watches the city breathe. Her pearls glint, dislodged, like tiny moons. Her hands shake in a way she has never permitted them to. For her, this is not only spectacle. It is a rupture in the uncomplicated narrative she has always inhabited, that her world is safe, that power is both shield and scepter. For Richard, it is a geometry problem he cannot solve alone. Jerome walks out into the night with his coat slung over one arm. Cameras follow him down the steps, but his pace is unhurried. He moves toward a taxi, toward a meeting with lawyers who will ratify the formal rescission, toward the phone calls that will set into motion the logistical work of redirecting funds and assembling testimony. He thinks of the children who will fill classrooms if the capital flows into neighborhoods that need it. He thinks of the barbershop's afternoon laughter. He thinks of all the ways to turn consequence into construction. He had smiled because he saw the machine beneath the moment. The smile was not an invitation to pity. It was a prelude to action, a private acknowledgement that a public injury could be converted into institutional accountability. People in the room called it stoicism. Others called it restraint. In reality, it is the beginning of a strategy. Use the law, contracts, and the public record to force accountability large enough to matter. As Jerome grips the leather portfolio, the city seems to gather itself for an argument. Across the wires, the first traders whisper. At desks where portfolios are balanced, a small calculation reroutes money for reasons that will be explained in minutes and in hours. The suit of Blackwood around the family empire starts to fray at one seam. That is the point. That is the meaning of his smile. Not passive endurance, but the quiet release of a lever. The next day will be a litany of calls. There will be press statements and legal filings. There will be hashtags and think pieces, and the inevitable parade of TV experts who will analyze what dignity looks like when it meets leverage. There will be cries for compassion and cries for punishment. For Jerome, the work is not spectacle. It is execution, in the old sense of carrying out a plan aligned with values. He wants to turn a spectacle of humiliation into a mechanism for investment where it is needed. He wants to make obligations enforceable, but in the hours immediately after the wine dries on his shirt, none of those processes are completed. The document is closed. The contract exists. The clause stands like a legal hinge. Vivian's world is unsettled. The Blackwood name has a new question mark beside it. In the quiet of the taxi, Jerome thinks of the next day's calendar and the ways policy and practice are not synonymous. He knows the long work begins ahead. Hearings, audits, redirected funds, community boards, and the slow logistics of implementing what was once only a clause. Outside the taxi window, downtown lights blur into a ribbon. Somewhere, a small team begins drafting a document that will create a new trust. Somewhere else, a young man who would be eligible for a microloan reads a headline and imagines a storefront. In rooms that count, somebody runs the numbers on how $1 billion retraction might ripple across regional markets. The machinery of consequence begins to engage with the machinery of reform. Jerome touches the edge of the portfolio and allows himself a final look. It is not triumph that etches his face. It is a preparedness he has cultivated across years of negotiation and nights in cheap hotels drafting plans that would survive other people's indifference. His smile at the gala was a hinge into the work he has always preferred, the patient conversion of offense into opportunity. He knows the world will not round to completeness overnight. He knows settlements take time, and oversight takes endurance. He also knows that for change to happen, someone has to convert moral outrage into enforceable terms. In the morning news cycle that will swallow him and spit him into analysis, someone will edit the clip down to a punchline. Some will praise him, some vilify him. But the portfolio in his hand, the signatures on the document, the clause that permits rescission will not care. Paper is impartial. It demands action. It forces process. The taxi drives off into the neon. In the rear view, Jerome watches a city that now carries a new story. Somewhere on the law firm's server, a notice of rescission is stamped with the time and channeled into practices that will insist on an accounting. Across the river, lights in the Blackwood boardroom flicker as men and women in suits pull the blinds and convene. The first call to the council's office has been made. 20 minutes after the clip posts, the phrase "Harker Blackwood Gala" trends. By dawn, the story will have lodged into comment sections and editorial calendars. Overnight, markets will respond with the dry, efficient cruelty of numbers. The full cascade, investigations, frozen assets, filings, has not yet arrived. But the mechanisms that will produce it are clicking into place, one deliberate, bureaucratic motion after another. Jerome stares at the leather binding again and lets his thoughts move away from spectacle to the work that follows. Filings, boardrooms, hearings, the careful rewiring of capital. He smiles once more, but it is smaller now. a quiet signal to himself. He has turned an assault meant to humiliate into leverage that, if handled wisely, can redirect money into people who have waited too long. Behind him, the city unfurls. Ahead, the legal engines begin to purr. The gala will remain a night of indignity, but the story will not end in a stain on fabric. It is only the opening chapter in a longer account of consequence, accountability, and the slow architecture of restitution. The taxi eases into a canyon of glass and steel. Jerome's reflection fragments in the window, the leather portfolio, the curve of his jaw, the city awake and judging. He steps from the cab with the same deliberate gait he used all evening, a man whose work clarifies consequence into contract. Lawyers wait in the lobby like surgeons preparing for a complicated procedure. Sarah Lane meets him with a tablet and a folder of bullet-pointed next moves. "If you want more stories about dignity and consequence, follow us," she says once, the CTA almost incidental. A quiet instruction for an audience that will soon want to watch how institutions respond. Jerome nods, and they begin. 9 a.m. Markets open. The Blackwood ticker blinks and then dips. It is mechanical and human at once. Algorithms respond to narrative the way birds respond to a shadow. By the time the morning shows cut away from background chatter, portfolio managers on 3 continents have repriced exposure. William Hayes, back from the gala with his own sleepless night, reads a parade of terse emails on his screen and hears the first panicked whisper, "We're seeing sell orders." He summons a call with Blackwood's board. In the boardroom, Richard paces like a man in a storm. He has always believed that money could grease friction. His world has been the economy of appearances. Now appearances have betrayed him. The council gives a briefing. Rescission notice received at 7:56 p.m., posted publicly at 8:12 p.m., trending tags, video views in the millions. Legal options: contest the withdrawal, attempt to salvage the agreement, or begin a controlled negotiation. Public relations options: apology, repudiation of Vivian's conduct, or containment. None of these options guarantee the restoration of comfort. Outside the glass, news helicopters crowd the sky. The Blackwood PR team drafts a statement that sounds practiced and hollow. "We condemn all acts of intolerance," it reads, the industry standard phrase that too often substitutes for real repair. William types and deletes. The correct language must be more than posture. It must address liabilities. He sends an urgent encrypted message to fund managers and counsel. "We need to hold capital movement steady," he writes. "Signal that the corporation is taking action." The council replies with the first legal sword. Injunction language, potential damages, and the specter of a civil suit for breach. Across town, Jerome's legal team files the rescission notice into the public record and triggers 2 parallel channels. A civil path to enforce the contract termination, and a civic path to push for accountability beyond mere optics. Sarah coordinates with a small press unit to make the agreement's community allocations visible in one clean public document: oversight structures, trustees, audit clauses, measurable milestones. Jerome's move is to make what is private public, which forces institutions to respond in visible ways. By noon, the clip has been threaded into the day's political conversation. Activists prepare statements. Community leaders demand precise commitments rather than platitudes. Mr. Johnson at his barbershop watches patrons' faces as they scan headlines. He hears names. Washington Center. He hears numbers. He hears futures recalculated. The barber's hands are steady. He has always cut hair around the edges of people's lives and seen the way a small investment can change a groom's prospects. He knows the stakes to be human. Within 48 hours, legal papers begin to multiply. A boutique civil firm files an emergency motion in state court seeking an order enforcing the rescission and compelling the Blackwood family to disclose related documents. Simultaneously, a local prosecutor's office opens an investigation into the gala assault after a complaint from an attendee and a public outcry. The prosecutor forwards material to federal authorities. When overt acts touch on commerce and interstate publicity, a federal interest enters the frame. That is when FBI Special Agent Maria Santos calls Sarah Lane. Maria is methodical, a woman comfortable turning noise into leads. She wants evidence. The videos, witness statements, the gala's guest logs, Messages between Vivian and aides. She wants to establish elements for assault and to assess whether civil rights statutes might apply when the attack is tied to the intent to intimidate because of race. Her tone is careful. She does not read outrage into footage. She reads actions into statutes. When Sarah hands over a curated packet with time codes and witnesses, Maria's team smiles the small, professional smile of those who take serious things seriously. By the second morning, subpoenas appear on lawyers' screens like the first rain during a drought. The Blackwood legal team, which had believed in the power of scrim and discretion, now faces open requests for phone records, emails, and guest lists. Vivian's phone pings incessantly. Friends drop away. In the court of social media, human judgment is instantaneous and often unforgiving, but in the court of law, the wheels are slower and heavier. Those wheels, however, begin to turn. The first hearing is procedural. A judge issues a scheduling order, and the headlines call it the first crack in an empire's facade. Jerome's counsel files a motion to make the community provisions enforceable by third-party audit, language that ensures the community will not be left to trust goodwill alone. They request preliminary relief, immediate hold on certain transactional changes tied to the development, no transfer of listed land, no withdrawal of pledged capital, pending discovery. That relief is aimed less at victory than at preservation. Preserve the possibility of redirecting funds if settlement negotiations produce that result. The Blackwoods consider a settlement. The word sits like hot metal in Richard's mouth. Settling means money leaving family control. Settling means oversight. Settling means admitting, practically if not verbally, that private life has public consequences. Board members privately weigh the cost. Reputational depreciation versus protracted litigation. The market price of indecision is visible in a falling line on a chart. Investors with short horizons sell. Activist groups push for governance reforms. The company, once presumed unassailable, begins to concede the possibility of structural change. In the interim, the story becomes intimate in other rooms. Vivian sits in an interview room under fluorescent lights with a lawyer standing over her like a priest offering options. She insists at first that she only meant to discipline an unruly presence, the way she believes the world needs her to do. She says she was provoked. The videos do not show provocation. They show her moving through a deliberate sequence. Words, gesture, the arc of the wine glass. Maria Santos watches the footage and asks precise questions. Vivian's answers are often evasive. When asked why she repeated the phrase that carries hatred's freight, she falters. "It was," she begins. The sentence dissolves. Scenes like this will later define her collapse, the confident script unwinding into taut self-defense. At the community level, the moment offers a different conversation. Aisha Thompson sits with a college acceptance letter in one hand and a live stream of the gala playing silently on the other. Aisha is 21, the first in her family to be on track for a vocational scholarship the proposed development might have supported. Her mother has worked 2 jobs for years. The idea that capital might pivot into her neighborhood no longer seems speculative. She texts a neighborhood organizer, "If this goes through, I might get a grant for the training program." In another part of town, an aspiring baker sees the microloan clause in Jerome's summary and imagines a shop with a bright red awning. These are small concrete imaginings that will come to mean lives in a way tickers cannot predict. There is a public relations choreography Jerome refuses to skip. He gives a short statement the day after the gala, his face composed, the leather portfolio on the podium like a relic of sober power. He frames the withdrawal not as vindictive, but as a fiduciary necessity. He speaks in terms of trustee duty. A board is charged with the long-term welfare of capital and its social obligations. He announces an intention to pursue alternatives, separate funding vehicles, community trusts, and enforceable oversight. He asks for patience and demands accountability. Reporters circle like crows, but many of their questions now orbit the details he has already made public. The allocation percentages, the oversight clauses, the named trustees. Jerome's team posts the contract language online, the way open source code allows public inspection. Visibility, he knows, is a form of pressure. By week's end, Two parallel sequences converge: criminal inquiry and corporate governance reckoning. Vivian is formally charged with misdemeanor assault and a state-level bias enhancement, a designation that increases the charge's severity if prosecutors can show the act was motivated by bias. Maria's team is cautious about federal civil rights charges. The threshold is higher, the timeline longer. But the public domain has already turned intangible derision into measurable cost. The equities market responds. Lenders call in covenants. The company's credit rating is discussed in hushed tones. Board members who once promised loyalty to family now whisper about fiduciary obligation to shareholders. Richard, feeling the ground shift under him, convenes a defensive playbook. Public contrition, donations to unspecified causes, and a promise to implement sensitivity training. William Hayes, pragmatic and cold, prepares a more sophisticated approach. An independent review, a recognition of cultural failure, and an offer to place funds into an escrow account pending negotiation. Jerome's people respond. Escrow only if the funds are managed by an independent community trustee and subjected to audit clauses. Negotiations begin with the slow motion of lawyers and the simmering heat of public anger. In a small courtroom 3 weeks later, the first motion hearing becomes a stage for civic argument. Jerome's counsel argues for immediate equitable relief. Put a portion of the Blackwood commitment into a federally monitored trust pending adjudication. The Blackwood attorneys scoff, offering instead a private arbitration clause. The judge, Patricia Williams, seasoned and clear-eyed, lists the equities on both sides and issues a tentative order. An interim escrow managed by a third-party firm, with a community advisory panel included. She marks the order as a signal that courts are not indifferent to the intersection of private contracts and public harm. Her words will be quoted in op-eds. "Power carries obligations," she remarks, a line that carries courtroom authority and moral weight without sermonizing. Settlement talks gather momentum. The Blackwoods face a chessboard of options: fight and risk further reputational hemorrhaging, or concede funds and governance now and attempt to preserve the core of their business later. Under intense pressure, investors withdrawing, board members fearful of personal liability, Richard authorizes talks. Negotiations are furious and detailed. Jerome's team insists that any settlement must contain enforceable, measurable commitments. A multi-year trust dedicated to affordable housing and vocational training. A microloan pool with clear underwriting for small businesses. Seats on the oversight board reserved for neighborhood representatives including Mr. Johnson. Mandatory auditing with public results. And a clause requiring the dismantling of certain internal practices that have historically excluded local contractors from procurement. Days stretch like legal rope. William Hayes shifts his posture from damage control to deal-making. He recognizes that a carefully staged settlement may salvage value. He offers a structured settlement, $750 million placed in escrow, half for direct development costs and half for a trust to be managed jointly by an independent fiduciary and a community board. The number is substantial, though less than Jerome's initial bargaining position. It is a compromise that allows the Blackwoods some dignity, a face-saving narrative that frames the settlement as a philanthropic pivot rather than admission of guilt. Settlement talks, however, do not exist in a vacuum. Activist groups and neighborhood leaders demand a role beyond being consulted. They demand trusteeship and enforcement. Jerome insists on that too. He knows that a fund without accountability becomes charity that repeats the same hierarchy. He counteroffers a governance matrix designed to eliminate tokenism. His team names criteria for trustee selection: real community experience, financial oversight capacity, and the power to withhold funds if agreed milestones are not met. In these negotiations, Jerome's smile, the precise, small curve in a crowded hall, comes to symbolize an approach to power that insists on structural checks. Meanwhile, Vivian's case proceeds along a different track. The prosecutor offers a plea bargain, guilty to a reduced assault charge in exchange for a sentence of community service, mandatory counseling, and a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The offer is controversial in the city. Some demand incarceration as a statement of zero tolerance for bias. Others argue that rehabilitation paired with restitution might be more useful in the long term. Maria Santos reads public reaction with clinical interest. Prosecutors weigh the community's appetite for punitive remedy against the practicality of repairing harm. Vivian vacillates. The courtroom becomes a theater where private repentance and public consequence meet in a dialectic. Vivian ultimately accepts a plea that includes structured accountability, a year of supervised community service, counseling focused on implicit bias and cultural competency, participation in restorative circles with individuals impacted directly by the gala, and supervision to ensure compliance. The plea does not erase harm. It complicates it. For those who bore witness, it is a small measure of formal consequence. For Vivian, it becomes the start of a difficult public apprenticeship in humility. The narrative resists tidy closure. Progress here is incremental, messy, human. At the same time, the settlement crystallizes into a legal instrument. The funds move into escrow under the watch of a court-appointed trustee. A community advisory board convenes and elects Mr. Johnson as a founding member, not for token optics, but because he knows neighborhood needs, vendor networks, and the social capital required to bridge trust. Aisha, selected from a pool of applicants for her demonstrated commitment to community education, earns a spot on a scholarship selection committee, an early and tangible example of youth participation in governance. She sits at the table, surprised and nervous, but determined. The first round of microloan applicants is vetted. A small bakery in a corner strip gets approved. A tech lab for teenagers is seeded with funds, and a manager is hired. Months later, the Washington Center for Dignity and Justice, Jerome insisted on the term, announces its opening. The center is not merely brick and glass. It is a bundle of processes and personnel who must learn how to convert funds into outcomes. The building opens with a ribbon cut by Mr. Johnson. Jerome stands slightly back, watching. The portfolio is no longer a secret artifact but a symbol converted into scaffolding. Inside, classrooms buzz with a mix of apprenticeship and administration. A room for legal aid clinics where residents can learn about contracts and tenant rights. A vocational workshop with 3D printers and welding stations. An incubator for micro-businesses with mentors on board. Aisha leads the first student orientation and describes the scholarship criteria with a seriousness that suggests she understands the stakes. The media narrative shifts from spectacle to program. Reporters visit the center and record scenes that became the counter-image to the gala. Kids programming robots, a woman closing on a small business lease, a culinary class that signs its first catering contract. Jerome and Sarah insist that coverage focus on measurable metrics. Number of loans disbursed, percent of apprentices placed in jobs, audit reports. They publish quarterly results. They open the books so volunteers and auditors can review spending. Transparency becomes an operational ethic. Not everyone approves. Critics on the left see Jerome as co-opting justice into capitalism. Critics on the right see the settlement as punitive and unfair. Boardrooms still whisper. The Blackwood family feels the sting of loss. They have ceded some control but gained a narrative of remediation. William Hayes navigates the new reality, using the lessons of crisis to restructure compliance and ensure the company's future viability. He sits on panels about corporate governance, telling a story about reputation and risk the way a convert tells a testimony. Vivian's path is slow and jagged. At first, her community service is scripted. Food banks, literacy programs. The staff at the Washington Center receive her with professional reserve. She enters programs under supervision and expects resistance. In restorative circles, she encounters people who tally the harm in human terms. Lost wages, humiliation, fear. The conversations are raw. At one session, a woman who had been present at the gala recounts the feelings of shame that lingered for days. Vivian listens and at first says little. Later, in private therapy, she begins to trace how family narratives of entitlement shaped her reactions. Whether she will become contrite in a way that produces transformation is unknown. The process is slow, and the city watches each step. Institutionally, other firms take notice. Boards at several firms revise social conduct clauses and reputational provisions. Corporate counsel hosts symposiums about behavioral risk as a line item in due diligence. A new field of consultants offers assessments of social exposure. The moment becomes a case study in business schools. not as moral spectacle, but as a lesson in the economics of reputation. How a private act, amplified by technology, forces markets to reconsider exposure. Public hearings extend the drama into formal accountability. Jerome is subpoenaed to testify before a congressional subcommittee that wants to examine corporate practices in urban development and corporate social responsibility. He speaks methodically, not from triumph but from a ledger of practice. He explains how enforceable oversight and community trusteeship can function. He refuses sanctimony and insists on hard metrics. Dignity is not an emotion we declare, he tells the committee. It is a structure we build. His testimony spurs legislative interest. Bills are proposed to encourage enforceable community benefit agreements in major urban developments. Some pass, some stall. Change here is incremental, not cinematic. In the months after, the Washington Center's impact accumulates in small administrative wins: apprentices who complete training and find employment, bakery owners who obtain second-round financing from a community loan pool, a vocational program that partners with a regional employer. Audits note that funds are being dispersed on schedule, and that a community board indeed exerts veto power over procurement decisions. These are not miracles. They are bureaucratic processes: contracts awarded, invoices paid, reports filed. Still, for people like Aisha and the bakery owner, these processes translate into changed lives. The legal aftermath continues to ripple. Civil suits are filed by a coalition of community groups demanding broader oversight on urban planning. Blackwood Industries faces shareholder suits alleging mismanagement. A few investors sue for recovery of lost value. Courts process these claims in the ordinary procedural way. Settlement negotiations continue, sometimes mediated by judges who emphasize transparency. The result is a mixed legal landscape: victories here, concessions there, a lot of legwork that will take years to resolve. Jerome is careful not to mischaracterize outcomes. He speaks in terms of timelines and audits rather than victories. That candor earns him a reputation not for vindication but for meticulous stewardship. At the Washington Center's one-year anniversary, the building hums with a different kind of camera attention. Journalists, local dignitaries, students, and ordinary neighbors fill a large room. Jerome gives a short address. He names people: Mr. Johnson, Aisha, the first microloan recipient. He does not gloat. He speaks of conversion, turning a moment of injustice into a mechanism that channels capital toward people previously excluded. He acknowledges the costs and the work yet to be done. His voice carries the same calm that had made the smile at the gala inscrutable. Now, however, the smile has been refashioned into a reputation for follow-through. The camera finds Vivian in the audience. She sits with a stock-still posture, a public figure engaged in the quiet, uncomfortable work of showing up to the consequences of her actions. In a small later segment, she joins a class on procurement and watches a presentation by a young entrepreneur whose loan allowed her to open a storefront. The entrepreneur speaks calmly about grit and plans. Vivian listens, and for the first time in public she looks small, not because she has been shamed into silence, but because she must reconcile the tangible outcomes of the harm she caused with the intangible scaffolding of her prior life. Viewers will parse her presence. Is this contrition, a legal obligation, or both? The story resists closure. 3 years in, more data exists. The trust funds have disbursed millions in development costs and microloans. Apprenticeships produce measurable employment outcomes. The center's audit reports show both successes and failures. Some businesses fail, some programs underperform, and administrative hurdles slow implementation. Jerome acknowledges the messiness publicly. He hires a director of program evaluation and publishes an annual impact report that admits mistakes and outlines improvements. Transparency, he believes, compounds trust. Vivian's legal record shows completion of mandated service and continued participation in rehabilitative counseling. She apologizes at a public forum. The apology is imperfect, stilted in places, sincere in others. The people she harmed decide how to accept or reject the overture. Some accept the apology conditionally, others remain skeptical. The arc of redemption, when it exists, is messy and patient. It is work done across years, not months. Richard ultimately resigns from the company's board. He sells a portion of his holdings and retreats from public life in search of privacy. The Blackwood brand endures, rebadged in some places and restructured in others. William Hayes carves a new role for himself advising corporate boards on social risk. He sometimes speaks to students about the day his calculus failed to predict the force of a viral moment. The lesson is both ethical and financial. When private contempt becomes public spectacle, systems must reckon in measurable ways. At a young entrepreneur's storefront opening, the Washington Center's grant certificate is framed on a wall. The bakery hums with midday customers. Aisha attends the ribbon cutting as a representative of the scholarship committee. She announces an internship program, and kids from neighborhood high schools file into the back room to see a real example of what a small infusion of capital and mentorship can do. Mr. Johnson sits at a corner table watching, his hands folded. He hums softly, pleased in the quiet way of someone who recognizes accumulated effort. In a quieter moment, Jerome returns to the barbershop where the whole thing feels, in a lowercase way, most like home. Mr. Johnson trims his hair while patrons talk about business licenses and grants with the same easy cadence they once used to discuss sports. Jerome listens. He speaks rarely, but when he does, he asks about the programs, about whether they feel relevant, about what else the community needs. These are the small, iterative conversations that animate institutions. The smile from the gala is nothing more and nothing less than a part of his repertoire, strategic, calibrated, a small curve that begins big processes. The moral question that begins the story now returns in a transformed register. It is no longer only about whether to respond to insult with immediate retaliation. It is about whether, when wrong is public, institutions and people will channel consequence into durable change. Jerome asks this of audiences in interviews and at the center. When you see injustice, do you choose reaction, or do you choose systems that can repair? His question is not rhetorical for him, it is a challenge framed by action. Years after the gala, certain images become emblematic. The wine stain in a montage of the news cycle, Vivian's halting apology, the leather portfolio opened into public view, Aisha holding her first scholarship check. But the scene that Jeremy returns to most often is simpler. A room full of teenagers at the center, learning to solder circuits while a mentor, once a beneficiary of a microloan, explains how credit lines work. Jerome watches them, and the smile settles into a different expression, one less charged and more like steady resolve. The Washington Center matures into an apparatus of accountability and opportunity that does not claim to fix every structural injustice. It offers processes, audits, oversight, loan committees staffed by neighborhood leaders, legal clinics, and vocational training. It invites critique and adapts. Its success is uneven, and its critics are sometimes right. Yet the center's existence proves a point, that a single act of public humiliation, amplified by cameras and social media, can, if met strategically, convert moral outrage into enforceable institutional change. In the evenings, Jerome walks past the center's large windows and watches the lights inside. The hum of commerce and learning is soft and steady. Sometimes he thinks of the gala's brief moment, the arc of a Bordeaux, the ripple of phones, the small curved smile, and he understands the story the city tells. A spectacle that could have been nothing more than a humiliating memory became, because of laws and contracts and stubborn people, a lever. The smile, people say, meant so many things. For Jerome, it meant leverage used with restraint, the translation of personal injury into system-level obligation. He does not celebrate the fall of another human being. He knows the cost of human ruin, but he also knows that consequences, when structured well, can be instruments of restoration rather than mere punishment. That conviction guides the Trust Board as it evaluates projects. Will this program create durable opportunity? Will oversight prevent capture? Will the community have real decision-making power? On the center's lawn, a mural grows, paint layered by neighborhood youth, colors washing over each other like a slow reconciliation. Vivian, months after completing her service, paints a small square in muted tones at the mural's edge, supervised and guided, her gestures tentative. No one expects that to absolve her. The mural is not about lifting blame. It is about creating a public space where consequences have visible outcomes. People can stand in front of it and remember that change requires both pressure and process. A decade later, historians and business students will still cite the evening wine as a turning point in corporate practice. A case study about how personal prejudice, when captured and amplified, can catalyze institutional reform. They will analyze clauses and counsel memos, quoting Judge Patricia Williams on court approaches to public harm. They will praise and critique Jerome in equal parts. The Washington Center will have produced its share of failures and successes. It will continue to be audited, adjusted, and sometimes misunderstood. That is how durable things are made, imperfectly and with time. In the quiet after another long day, Jerome returns to his office and opens the portfolio, not as a relic of night one, but as a reminder of tools. He flips through the pages, minutes of trustees' meetings, audit notes, letters from scholarship recipients, a photograph of the barber shop that once cheered him on. He lays a hand on the leather and smiles, small, measured, not gloating, and thinks of the long work ahead. The smile is a memory and a method, the knowledge that power, when matched with procedure and persistence, can convert wound into a reason to rebuild. Outside the window, the city lights tilt. Inside the center, laughter rises from a classroom where a group of teens assemble a robot. Aisha, now a program coordinator, watches them with the kind of quiet pride that only comes from having once been a hopeful on the other side of a desk. Mr. Johnson hums in the room next door, as the neighborhood's kid with a fresh haircut asks him about applying for an apprenticeship. The final image is not a courtroom transcript nor a headline. It is the sound of people working. It is the small, stubborn noise of programs operating, checks cleared, loans processed, business licenses obtained. It is the ordinary, faithful labor of conversion, of outrage given legal form and turned into an architecture that, imperfectly, widens possibility. When you think of the man who stood with wine on his shirt and smiled while cameras watched, remember this. He smiled because he saw lever, law, and ledger beneath the spectacle. He smiled because he knew how to turn injury into enforceable accountability. The rest, hearings, settlements, community centers, apprenticeships, are the slow answers to a question that is still urgent. When we witness injustice, what will we do with the power we hold? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Consider how your community responds when its people are humiliated. Will you choose reaction or the long work of repair?